Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Socratic Stage, a feature program at New College of Florida. We're honored to have you here, both live and live streaming. This is a unique program that President Corcoran brought to New College about a year ago, and we're now in, I think, our 7th or 8th Socratic Stage with an exciting program tonight. Every one of these we seem to have unique perspectives, and I think everyone brings their better angels to these debates. Civil discourse, I think, has for a while went out of style in America, and we're doing our best to bring it back. I think if we can set the example here, we can have a large impact not only on higher ed, but on building better citizens. Military service has a long honored tradition in our country, and the debate tonight, I think, brings interesting perspectives about 50 years, 45 years after the draft conscription ended, and where there are different ideas now that are certainly much different and perhaps less heated than they were in the early 70s, late 60s, when protests were rampant and other things were going on. I get the opportunity tonight to, at least for a moment, maybe, not necessarily introduce, but introduce the person who's introducing. One of my heroes is a younger man in life. I might have earned a PhD, but it's truly rare that people like me get to introduce someone introducing a general, a 4-star general. My PhD is nice, but my DD 214 still reflects that I am but a PFC. That's private first class for those of you who might not know. So the Steamboat Institute is our proud partner tonight, and I get the pleasure of introducing Jennifer Schubert-Aiken, who is chairman and CEO of the Institute, an organization founded in 2008. The Steamboat Institute promotes America's first principles and encourages civilized discourse by hosting debates on college campuses across America. Jennifer is a member of the advisory boards for Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the Ed Snyder Center and Enterprise for Markets at the University of Maryland. She also serves on the board of directors of Rebecca's Angels, a nonprofit organization helping children with post-traumatic stress disorder, founded by Boston Marathon bombing survivor Rebecca Gregory. It gives me great pleasure not only to welcome you and our guests to New College tonight, but please welcome Jennifer Schubert-Aiken to kick off our program tonight. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Welcome.
Well, good evening, everyone. He's just a bit taller than me, just a little. Thank you, Provost Rancourt, for such a warm welcome to your beautiful campus here at New College in Sarasota, Florida. Since we already have several inches of snow on the ground back home in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, I was happy to have an excuse to come to Florida. It's great to be on the campus, and got to go for a run this morning without having to bundle up in my winter gear, so I enjoyed that a lot. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We also want to thank our online audience. Since we started live streaming these debates on YouTube, we've been finding that is a great way to get people all over the country watching these debates. We truly appreciate having the opportunity to partner with New College and the Socratic Stage, which is a great program they have here at New College to bring compelling discussions. Tonight's debate is the 7th and final stop in the fall edition of our Campus Liberty Tour debate series. We have visited 7 campuses in 7 states over a 7-week period with a unique debate topic at each location. Last month, we were at Virginia Military Institute with a debate between Vivek Ramaswamy and John Bolton on U.S. foreign policy. We also made a stop at Harvard with a debate between Jonathan Turley and Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy on whether Harvard supports free speech and ideological diversity on its campus. Our other stops included Brown University with a debate on electric vehicles, University of Texas at Austin with a debate on immigration policy, the University of Maryland with a debate on taxing wealth, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a debate on whether we need more democracy. You can view all of these debates and the full debate schedule, including the topics and speakers, at steamboatinstitute.org, and you can watch any of the previous debates on Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel, so we hope you'll do that. As with all of Steamboat Institute's debates, the emphasis is on civility and teaching students and all who attend how to think, not what to think. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the support of many generous individuals and foundations to bring programs such as tonight's debate to audiences all over the country. I would like to extend a special thank you to the Adolph Coors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, the Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, and the Arthur N. Roop Foundation for their support, which is helping us to bring these debates all over America. Given the current global chaos and instability in many regions of the world, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, China's aggression toward Taiwan, and nuclear threats from North Korea, how can we best ensure America's national security? Is our military prepared to face these multiple and escalating threats? Should we reinstate a draft for mandatory military service to increase our capacity for dealing with these threats? Tonight's program will examine this issue with a debate on the following resolution. Be it resolved, the U.S. should reinstate a draft for mandatory military service. We invite all of our audience members, both here and watching online, to respond with your view on this resolution, agree, disagree, or undecided, before the debate begins using the QR code provided. So it's absolutely okay to pull out your phone and use your phone to cast your vote. We will then ask your opinion again after the debate to see if opinions have shifted. So take a moment to vote. The more people who vote, the better. We want this to be as representative as possible of our audience. Those of you watching the live stream will see this link in the chat, and you can click on that link to participate in the poll. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and moderator for this evening. So if I could ask them to please come out and take their seats, and then I will briefly introduce each of them. Let's give a warm welcome to our speakers and moderator. Arguing the affirmative on our resolution is General Stan McChrystal, retired four-star general and former head of the U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan, as well as the former leader of Joint Special Operations Command. Called one of America's greatest warriors by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, he led the military's most sensitive forces and created a revolution in warfare that fused intelligence and operations. His leadership is credited with the December 2003 capture of Saddam Hussein and the June 2006 location and killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. General McChrystal now shares his leadership insights off the battlefield. He is the CEO and chairman of the McChrystal Group, which helps Fortune 500 companies strike the right balance between hierarchical and decentralized team mindsets and structures. He is also the author of the best-selling books Leaders, Myth and Reality, My Share of the Task, and Team of Teams, which explores how organizations can break down silos and work together more effectively in the modern business environment. In his latest book, Risk, A User's Guide, he provides a battle-tested system for detecting and responding to risk. Please give a warm welcome to General Stan McChrystal. Arguing the negative on our resolution is William Ruger, president of the American Institute for Economic Research. Ruger is a veteran of the Afghanistan War and was awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, among other decorations. He remains an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve Component with the rank of commander. Ruger was nominated by President Trump to serve as the U.S. ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and was a prominent advocate for ending America's participation in the Afghanistan War. Ruger was appointed by the president to the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board at the U.S. Department of State in 2020, serving from 2020 to 23. He earned his PhD in politics from Brandeis and an AB from the College of William and Mary. His scholarship has appeared in a number of academic journals. His most recent scholarship examines the relationship between military service combat experience, and civic participation. Ruger has written op-eds for numerous outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and others. He serves on several nonprofit boards, including the Center for the National Interest, Defense Priorities, the American Conservative, and the John Quincy Adams Society. Ruger is also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Let's give a warm welcome to Will Ruger. And our moderator for this evening's debate is Brad Polumbo, an independent journalist and co-founder of Based Politics. Brad's work has appeared in Newsweek, the New York Post, National Review, USA Today, The Daily Beast, and many other outlets, and he's appeared on many cable news outlets, including Fox News, Fox Business, Sky News, and others. Brad is host of the Brad versus Everyone podcast, which I highly recommend for its humor and insight on the hot topics of the day. He graduated from the University of Massachusetts with a degree in economics and political science, and in August, he was named the recipient of Steamboat Institute's Tony Blankley Fellowship for Public Policy and American Exceptionalism. And now, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. Make sure that you've voted in our pre-debate poll because that will be relevant. We'll be measuring the change in people's opinions between the start of the night to the end of the night. It's a very important topic, hopefully one that won't become immediately relevant anytime soon, but whether we should reinstate the draft for mandatory military service. I'm really honored to be here with the Steamboat Institute and two great guests. First, I will invite up the General to give his opening statement.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for the kind words, and I don't see that many people in this audience that have to worry about a military draft, so I think you're pretty safe. So what am I going to tell you about a military draft? Obviously, I'm arguing in the affirmative, but my real answer is, should you have a military draft, should we? And the answer is, if we need it. And I'll explain what I mean by that. First off, drafts are difficult. Conscription is difficult. It's expensive. It's hard to administer. It's typically unpopular politically, particularly if the actions around it, the war that's ongoing, whatever, is not well supported. So it's a difficult thing to do. It's not an easy button for a shortage of people. But the real question on conscription always comes back is, what are you doing it for, and what problem are you trying to solve? If we go to our Constitution, one of the key ideas is the common defense of a nation. That is the responsibility that we all accept as citizens to be part of the common defense of every other citizen. So we all have, along with our inalienable rights, we have responsibilities that go with that. And in the case of common defense, in the world in which we have lived to date, that requires a military capability. And so that military capability goes up and down. And people say, do we need a draft? And the answer is, you don't answer that question first. You answer first the question, what is our military requirement? If we start with defending ourselves, what do we need militarily? Numbers of people would be one of the variables to defend the homeland, but also to defend our strategic interests around the world that our government decides warrant that. Think of the frigates that were built to take on the Barbary pirates early in the 19th century. Critical part of our freedom of trade at that point, the decision was made, we'd make a military investment to do that. So when we talk about what size Army or Navy, and I'll use the term Army a lot because I grew up in the Army, but throughout it, I'm talking about all the military services, how big a force we need, the answer is it depends. It is different when the threats are low, or when we have other capabilities, whether they're geographic advantages we've had, or technological advantages, or alliances that we're a part of. And at other times, we've had to increase our military capability, think in terms of manpower significantly. But this is a separate, independent issue that should be arrived at by policymakers, aided by people with experience and expertise that can figure out how much military you actually need. So before we ever get to the idea, should we draft people or have volunteers, you start with identifying the requirement and sorting that out. And then the question is, how do you man a force? There are basically three ways to man a force. The first is volunteers. You ask people who will go forth to serve. Most of the people that fight in most of our wars volunteered to do so. At the height of our conscription in World War II, we brought in 10 million people through conscription, but we also stopped voluntary enlistment. So the reality is, although 61.2% of the soldiers that fought in World War II on the ground, in fact, had been conscripted, had we not had conscription, we probably would have had significant volunteer. So you have an opportunity to do a volunteer force to a point. But I would point out it's very expensive. More than 61% of the U.S. defense budget right now goes for manpower. When we talk about manpower, that's pay, that's retirement, that's partly the medical care. And because a volunteer force tends to be more mature, they tend to be married, so you are now paying for families that in a conscripted army are not as big a cost. So the reality is, to have a volunteer army of any size, it's very, very expensive. And to compete with the civilian marketplace for the kinds of talent and expertise that a modern force needs is pretty difficult. The propensity to serve or the level of interest to serve, for example, right now, isn't very high. Only 23% of young Americans are qualified to enlist in the service without a waiver. So 77% of young Americans can't enlist if they want to, or they have to get a waiver for some issue that they have. But of that 23%, only 9% have indicated an interest to serve. So if you think about it, the number of young Americans who say, I'm really interested in serving in the military is pretty small. So if we talk about a volunteer force, sometimes we've got to put it against the backdrop of what's happening in our nation, what's happening in the world, and how difficult it would be to recruit the kinds of people that we need. As you know, when recruiting gets very difficult, as it has been for the last few years, the first pressure goes, failure to meet numbers produces this dynamic inside the force to do everything you can. And then, of course, there's a pressure to lower standards. The U.S. Navy, starting 2 years ago, started taking in what we call Cat 4s, people who get a low score, essentially, on the ASVAB test. And they brought in about 17% of their recruits are Cat 4s. For most of my career, we wouldn't touch a Cat 4 because we demanded higher. But when the market is such, that requirement goes because you can't, there's not enough money to keep throwing at it. So we can say we want an all-volunteer force, but at a certain point, that all-volunteer force gets practically difficult to implement. Now, there's another option if you don't want an all-volunteer force. That's to outsource it. Think mercenaries. Think of the days of Blackwater in Iraq. And I thought that was a mistake. We actually paid private contractors to do many things that were pretty close to combat. The problem with that is they're not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So you don't have the same kind of discipline over the force, potentially, that you do otherwise. And then if we historically look at the use of mercenaries or simply paid people, the Janissaries, which were formed in the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century, they were slaves. They became very, very competent, so competent that they could overthrow the leadership of the Ottoman Empire. So you can have the tail that you put onto the dog suddenly start to wag the dog. And so I don't think that a mercenary or an outsourcing approach necessarily works. So now we come back to conscription. So what do you do for conscription? My personal view is we have a selective service system that is in place right now. And I think we obviously need to keep that robust because it needs to work when we need it. And then if we need people, we need to draft the people we need. One of the things that has always been a challenge in previous wars is we tended to let certain things corrupt our conscription system. During the Civil War, if you had $300, you could buy a substitute. And that substitute went off in your stead. There were some substitutes that did it 4 and 5 times by deserting and coming back and getting $300 more. But also, many of us know during the Vietnam War, there were decisions made to give student deferments and whatnot. And so you had a disproportionate representation of the force that was fighting the war that was not representative of all of the population. During the Vietnam War, not a single son or daughter of a member of Congress was killed in combat.
We are over on time. If you could just wrap up.
Sure. My mistake, sorry. And so my point is, I think we need a conscription system, and I think we need to be prepared to use it to the extent that's required. Thank you.
Great. It's great to be here tonight at Sarasota at the new College of Florida. So thank you all for being here and hosting this debate, especially the Steamboat Institute. It's also an honor to be on stage with a distinguished American military officer like General McChrystal, who so ably led our troops in the Middle East. So it's great to be here. But we do disagree on the prompt. But I think it's important for us to engage in a civil debate, since civil debate has, I think, been in decline in this country. So I appreciate this opportunity. But let me begin my case against the draft. My case can be boiled down to 3 main arguments. A draft doesn't make sense to me on moral grounds, on economic grounds, and on military grounds. First, the moral. So in a free society, the one established by our founding fathers, people are free to live and order their lives as they see fit, as long as they respect the equal rights of others. In other words, we can choose our occupations. We can choose our futures ourselves, as long as we don't directly harm other people. That is part of the great American way, the reason why people like us join the military in the first place. But conscription, I think, is inconsistent with a free society because it forces people to join the military against their will, even in peacetime. It means we are forcing young men and women to serve in the military and to potentially kill and be killed involuntarily in a war that they may or may not agree with. So I say that this is immoral. It might even violate the 13th Amendment to our Constitution, which prohibits involuntary servitude. And not only would it be immoral if it were universal, it would be potentially even worse if it weren't, right? It would be unfair and arbitrary to draft by lottery, and it would be subject to all kinds of cronyism and corruption if things like deferments were allowed. And how would we enforce a universal draft? Would we really want to send the police around to arrest and imprison a young 18-year-old woman if she wanted to go start a career or get married and have kids instead? Or would we only tax her for life, making her ineligible for government programs as a way to punish her for not wanting to join the military? There's also an economic argument. Indeed, one of the reasons why we got rid of the draft about 50 years ago was that economists like Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman and Gary Becker showed how economically bad it was for America, and the government agreed, and that's why it got rid of the AVF, or all volunteer force. So let me talk about some of those economic costs. So one is that the opportunity cost of the draft is enormous. Young Americans would be forced to stop their education or their entry into a productive workforce. That's a real cost, something that's not offset by learning to march or fire a rifle. And all the while, jobs go unfulfilled in our economy. And the economy is the golden goose that allows for us to afford the best military in the world. And it misallocates those resources. That's something that Gary Becker talked about. And a trite one would be that it just would seem silly to have LeBron James, who added so much value to the economy when he was 18 years old, as proven by the salary he earned, being forced into military service. And people that disagree with the draft 50 years ago would talk about Elvis, about how that was a misallocation of resources. And that happens across the economy. It's also the case that having to employ millions of young people in the military all at once will lead them to being misused. As one opponent of the draft and national service said, when labor is both free and abundant, it will be squandered and abused. And if we had a draft plus national service for those who didn't want to join the military, the government would have to create a lot of make-work jobs or displace low-income workers already struggling to get ahead on the ladder of success. The other thing I'd mention, and I think that Stan and I could get into this in the discussion in a fruitful way, is that I don't think the cost of our military will be cheaper. What economists would say is that we would simply transfer the costs from the taxpayer to the young person if they were forced to take a lot less pay than they would demand to join voluntarily, right? So with the all-volunteer force, if you have to pay them X plus, if you only have to pay them X because you're forcing them to join, then really you're just transferring that cost. In terms of the economics of it, it's a wash. So there are no free lunches. This is what's called the conscription tax. And meanwhile, we'd have to train a lot more people in basic military skills than we would actually need for even World War III. This is also a great cost because, look, there are 3 to 4 million young people every year that would be eligible for a universal draft. And the final argument is a military one that should be compelling to you even if the economic or moral ones are not. So in a Washington Post interview, a famous retired American general argued that, quote, "The volunteer army that I served in was this extraordinary fighting machine." That general was Stan McChrystal, my debating partner this evening. And he's right. I agree with him. We have an amazing military. And we saw that on the battlefields of the Middle East. So it is the greatest fighting force in the world right now, the AVF. But I ask you, why would we want to make such a radical change in how we man our military when it is working so well already? Sure, we have some recruiting challenges, but that doesn't require a peacetime draft to solve. We could increase pay and benefits to attract more people, or even cheaper, we could just make military life less annoying due to so many, if anybody served, they know all the stupid bureaucratic rules. Also the politically correct training sessions. And whether we have a woke military or not, that's a big debate. The fact is that those things do distract from the kind of lethality and core missions that the military does or should do, and that cause people to want to voluntarily join, right? It's one of the reasons why the Marine Corps does a better job recruiting, I think, than the other services, because they're showing what it means to be a Marine, not talking about being a global force for good, which is what the Navy used as its slogan for a long time. Now, a draft would harm our military in so many ways. So one is we would need to transfer more resources currently devoted to creating a high-skilled, high-tech, professionalized force to one that processed millions of short-term conscripts in basic military skills. I'd rather have a smaller military with greater professionalization and skill rather than a larger one. This is especially the case when, as military expert Steve Biddle has argued, success in war is connected so much to mastering the modern system of combined arms fighting. And that's hard to master and can't be done easily by a conscript army in a highly technical world. And also, since the draft would be enormously expensive, we'd also have less money for high-tech platforms and capabilities that make our military so lethal and so feared. And in an era of debt and deficits, we aren't going to have money for it all. And I think it would also undermine morale as well as good order and discipline. As one officer said, "Why would I want to be in charge of people who don't want to be there?" So for all these reasons and others, a draft is not something that professional military leaders generally want. And I think that it's something we should avoid. And we shouldn't use the military, I think, as a multi-tool for every problem in our country. And I think one thing we can talk to, because I know that the general has spoken eloquently about this, is the issue of national unity and how a military could or could not support that, or how a draft could or could not support that. But again, so for moral, economic, and military reasons, I think we should stick with the all-volunteer force that is the envy of the world and reject calls for a draft. Thank you.
Thank you both. So now we'll move on to our moderated conversation, but please remember that you have the ability to submit questions, which I will then review and pick some of your questions to ask both our debaters tonight. First, I think I'd like to dive into this with you guys a little bit, where I'm sure we'll get into it on the pragmatic level, but one point that was raised was the moral question. So first, to you, General, how can it be moral to force someone into a situation where their life may be in danger, or they may even have to take another life?
Yeah. We force people to pay taxes. We force people to follow laws. It is part of an agreement we make when we enter the covenant of being a citizen of the United States. And that is as old as history. As I mentioned, galley slaves on Athenian galleys were citizens. And that was because that was considered a responsibility. So I don't think it's immoral to ask people to live up to their responsibilities, some of which are more difficult than others.
And Dr. Ruger, your thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I think that forcing people to work for the good of others is not something that is part of the American way of thinking about what a free society is. It's one of the reasons why I think that the 13th Amendment's prohibition against involuntary servitude is there, because we find it repugnant when we think about the draft, we're talking about the potential for using physical violence against people who don't want to do it. Now, most people will go down there and they'll sign up because they do want to obey the law, even an unjust one. But the fact is that at the end of the day, you are going to have to send the police to force the people who don't want to go. And if you don't send the police to do that, then you're going to have massive violations of the law that will undermine, I think, some of the unity in our society that the draft is oftentimes said to help. So again, I just think it's wrong to force people to do it. The other thing is that if military service is virtuous, and I think it is, then it has to be freely chosen, right? There's a real, I think, issue when we think about forced voluntarism, like when public schools make kids volunteer, you lose a lot of the virtue of the act itself. And so I think it would undermine the spirit that we have in an all-volunteer force, that we're all here because we believe in our country, we believe it's important to do this, and that it's a virtuous way to live. A non-voluntary force would undermine that virtue.
Well, let's come back to that point in a moment, but stay on the morality for a moment. So, General McChrystal, the school of thought that you're laying out here, could that be applied to other scenarios? In that if there is a national need that you view as part of the covenant of being a citizen, could the government force people to build roads if there's a national need for infrastructure? Or is the military a specific carve-out that principle of forced labor, or some might even view it as slavery, is acceptable for, or is that generally something that is morally acceptable in your view more broadly?
Well, if we go back to early parts of American society where we had volunteer fire departments in a much greater number, where we had militias that were required for the survival of a frontier settlement and whatnot, you had to have the ability to count on the fact that the people would be there to participate, or it just doesn't work. And so the reality is, we can argue moral, but if there's a requirement for a shared work to be done, then it has to be done. We'll remember in Afghanistan, there used to be an immigration system, not an immigration system, a system of moving water to crops. And it required tunnels. Mm-hmm. And what it did is it moved from high ground to low ground. And you had to get underground and clean out those tunnels on a periodic basis. It was called a Collage system. Everyone in the community had to go dig, because if you didn't, it didn't work, and nobody has water. So there are things like that in any society that comes together as an organized society that some people might think it's immoral. But if we have a real requirement, then I think it's a requirement.
So Dr. Ruger, I guess that's the question then. You talked a lot about the spirit of freedom, of choosing your own destiny, and how you feel the part of what makes it immoral to draft someone is to deprive them of that. But isn't it also true that that system only exists because we are able to preserve our national security from foreign invaders, from threats to national security? So, I mean, in that case, can't you make that moral justification in that freedom only exists with some limitations upon it in the first place that are necessary for it even to exist in the first place?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is I would challenge the notion that it is necessary in the first place, because I think that a volunteer military has been more than sufficient to meet the tasks that we've asked of it over the last 50 years of experience with the all-volunteer force. We haven't needed more manpower. What we've had to do is actually make sure that we compensate people who have joined the military better. That's led to better housing, better benefits, more pay. So when the all-volunteer force came to being in the 70s, pay had to go up to attract people to join it. That was actually good, okay, because that allowed for young enlisted men and women to actually be compensated closer to the true cost of their service, which is something that I think we ought to be doing. Because again, when you have involuntary work, uh, it doesn't mean that there isn't an economic cost. It just shifts the cost from one person or persons to another. So the taxpayer did have to pay more for the military after we got rid of the all-volunteer force, but that's because of the fact that before we were essentially getting on the cheap on the backs of young men and women who were forced to serve. And I think this is a much more just system when we actually pay people for the service they're rendering for society. And we've been able to do that, especially because one of the things is that labor and technology can be substitutes. So the economists who have studied the draft have shown that actually it can stimulate demand for technology to overcome some of those aspects of manpower. So the Chinese military may have relied more on blunt force of numbers. The American military has used technology to offset that in a way that is especially lethal. So technology is a huge force multiplier. And I think that that's a good thing and much better than just relying on masses of low-paid people who don't want to be there. They're involuntary.
But just on the moral question, because so you argued, and I'm sure we'll get into this, that it is not in fact necessary.
Right.
But what if you were to indulge me for a moment and assume it is necessary? Would that change the moral calculation that we need a draft to protect ourselves? Is it still immoral?
Well, I think one way to look at it is that if a society is so valuable to us, if a system of government, like the system of freedom that we have in this country, is so valuable to people, then I think men and women of virtue that care about that system will step up and support it. And if they're not willing to do that, then that sends an important and powerful signal to the people in charge that perhaps their policies are unpopular. So for example, if people stopped wanting to go to Vietnam and fight in that war voluntarily, like imagine we had a volunteer military at that time, that may have sent a very powerful signal to the leaders of our country that people didn't think it was worth us fighting in Southeast Asia and churning through 58,000 Americans who died there. That would have sent that powerful signal, and maybe we would have lost fewer. And again, if you think about the Vietnam War, a very unpopular policy that turned out not to be a necessary war. I praise all the men and women who fought there because they did what their duty was. But the fact is this was not a war that the United States should have been fighting, and it would have sent that signal. And I think the same thing about other wars. So again, I do think in most instances, men and women will step up in this country and do the right thing. Now, if you ask me, like, would I let the heavens fall? Okay? That's a different situation, but we don't argue about, like, should we engage in cannibalism, even if the whale ship Essex, when it sunk, led to in extremis behaviors by the people in the ship. We don't face that today. We're not even close to that.
Well, sometimes in philosophy class, you might have to debate that, right? In the worst possible scenario.
Sure, but as one of my friends used to say, the reason why lifeboat ethics isn't the best way to make arguments is because we don't generally live in lifeboats.
I certainly wouldn't want to. General McChrystal, so back to you on this moral question. What do you make of the argument that if people aren't willing to step up and defend a society, if they don't feel in large enough numbers that is their duty as citizens, does that society deserve to be defended?
That's a sort of basic question. I would argue that the vast majority of Americans think that it does. Even those people who are past the age or before the age of being drafted, I would think that a lot of elderly people who served in World War II would like the belief that young citizens would stand up if, in fact, we had a requirement for the kinds of people. And sometimes it's not just numbers. Sometimes it's getting the right qualifications. We have a very highly technical force now, but the highly technical people are not, for the large part, interested in enlisting in the military. And so we say, well, we'll change the rules, and to use your term against you, we'll make it more woke so that they're more comfortable. Which, as an old general, it's not something that makes me more comfortable in the military. But the reality is, I think that the morality, you have a commitment if you are going to be a part of this society, there is a commitment that sometimes is onerous.
And what do you make of the economic arguments that Dr. Ruger has raised that taking young people away from their education, that maybe some people's skills aren't really suited to military life, you're massively misallocating labor and passing costs from the taxpayer onto individuals in lower lifetime earnings and other things, lost years of income? I want to give you a chance to respond to that argument.
Yeah, I know Milton Friedman said, you don't want a highly trained physician being a poorly trained soldier. That's not the best use of talent or skills. And that's absolutely true. And of course, even during massive times of conscription during World War II, we tried to protect essential people in the workplace. So it's a balance. But the reality is, war is not efficient. It is very inefficient if you lose it. And so I would argue this is a time where you are going for effectiveness over efficiency.
Right. And I guess that does raise the question that we've already both hinted at today. Is the question of military conscription still relevant in 2024? Do you still have a need as a military fighting force for just raw manpower? Or is it more highly specialized, undercutting the need to just bring people in for short-term conscription, General McChrystal?
Yeah. Well, the answer is we have not needed, as you quoted me, we had a great volunteer force. But I used to go to remote bases across Afghanistan in my last assignment there. Every time I landed at one of these platoon-sized bases, one of the NCOs or officers there was the son or daughter of someone that I served with. And so what we have created is a military that is largely the sons and daughters of the military. My father was a soldier. My grandfather was a soldier. My 4 brothers were soldiers. My sister married a soldier. My wife's father was a soldier. Her 3 brothers were soldiers. Her sister's the widow of a soldier I served with. That's the force we have created. Now, that's not inherently negative, but in 1995, 40% of all young people had a parent who had served in uniform. Now it's 12%. And so the idea of service, the idea of sharing responsibility and what comes with citizenship, sometimes in uniform, I think is utterly critical.
And Dr. Ruger, just the same question to you. Do you think that the requirements of the 21st century have made conscription something that can just be left in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? We've had an all-voluntary force, for 50 years, and it's performed amazingly on the battlefield. Our problems in warfare have been at the strategic level, right? It's been with civilian decision makers and with top military leaders. It hasn't been with their effectiveness on the battlefield, using the modern system, engaging with highly technical platforms to accomplish tactical ends. The general knows more about this than I ever would in terms of what happened with JSOC and the capabilities that they had to do high-value individual targeting. So I think, I think that we've done amazing with an all-volunteer force. The other thing I would say on this is that we should be careful about thinking that technology is always a substitute. As we've seen in the war in Ukraine, numbers matter too. But we're also a country that's massive, right? I mean, we have 330 million Americans, and we're very far away from peer competitors. We have friendly neighbors. And so the requirements for us in combat would be much more, I think, are much lower than would be required. Because again, what is it, about 3 to 4 million people turn 18 every year, General?
About 4.
About 4 million people. And so what that means is that number alone would swamp the size of the military we have right now alone. And so if you're talking about in peacetime having a draft where you're bringing in 3 to 4 million people every year, because naturally there would be some people who were not able to serve because of disabilities, you're still talking about millions of people. And over the course of, say, a group of people that have gone for 10 years, that's just a much more massive amount of manpower than we need. And so if we're really just going to train people year after year in the basics and having them serve in the military for a year, that kind of inefficiency for what you actually need for the battlefield is massive, and I would say a waste. And that's why I think it's really important to understand the prompt for this, right? It doesn't say, should we have a draft if we're involved in World War III and the voluntary military is not able to defeat the Chinese? It's, do we have a peacetime draft, right? It's, do we have a draft and mandatory military service regardless of the circumstances? And that's why I think that the negative is the right approach here, because we're talking about bringing in millions and millions of Americans every year to go through basic military training at great cost, especially because it means that the professional military members are going to have to train these people, and that's going to be an allocation away from their primary duties at mastering the military science as a professional.
So, General, I just want to give you a chance to respond to that, or do you have a different vision of how it would play out?
Well, I think it could play out numbers of ways. I had not thought about it, bringing every young person in and training them for X amount and spitting them back out. I think you identify the number of people that you need to have trained, you bring them in for a period of time. I think you go for every zip code in America. You don't just go to places where people don't have sufficient resources to find a way out of it, because when you go to war, you want every zip code represented, so that in Congress, people are having that debate. I think I wouldn't be shy about doing targeted drafts. If you've got particular expertise in something and you're making a lot of money, we did that with doctors for the Korean War. And we brought doctors in because we couldn't recruit enough. I would do the same thing here. But if you go to countries that have a system like this, like Israel, they will argue about everything. But they start almost every conversation with, hey, what brigade were you in? And they may not have loved it, but there is a connecting tissue that I think gives a strength to a nation, that shared experience.
Yeah, that's one of the strong arguments for this, is building a sense of national unity in a time when a lot of young people don't particularly like America, or don't have a strong sense of community with each other because they've grown up looking at screens, or their school went virtual. Or is there not a case for national unity through some form of mandatory service like you see in places like Israel?
So again, if we're going to truly have a unitive experience, it can't be targeting a few doctors around the country. It can't even be a small number of people from each zip code. To truly have that unity, you would have to have something like a universal draft. And so you would be talking about training 3 to 4 million people every year. That's really, really expensive. And we would have a manpower-intensive military, not the lethal fighting force we have now. I'm even suspect that it would have that unitive effect, because I think the problems in our society aren't because we don't have a shared military experience. It's because we have a very polarized population on core kind of metaphysical and philosophical questions about, you think about the abortion debate, about like when life begins. I'm not sure going into the military at age 18 is going to change everybody's mind about those basic fundamental questions like that. I think that's why we have polarization. And what I would say is that one way, and I'm going to steal this argument from Ilya Somin, a professor at George Mason, he said we could actually have more unity in this country if we've suppressed speech, right? Because some speech could be damaging, right? I think during the Cold War, communist speech undermined or eroded the potential for defense of the free market and the free society. So we could suppress that speech. We could suppress religious differences. And we all think that would be nuts, right? Because we believe those are core fundamental human rights that we have, to believe as we believe and to speak as we speak. Well, I also think, and Ilya says, that actually the freedom to avoid forced labor is also a basic right. So when it comes to free speech, religious freedom, the freedom to choose your occupation and not be forced into servitude, those are fundamental rights that I don't think would be justified in order to have some kind of ephemeral greater national unity. There are other ways we could try to, I think, have greater national unity. That's not one of them. And one of them, for example, is I'm looking forward to our 250th anniversary as a country. And I think those types of efforts to try to sell what is common amongst us would be much better use of money than the massive billions and billions of dollars that we'll have to spend to have this type of unit of experience. And then the last thing I would say about this, it's also possible that forcing people into the military will unify them. it will unify them against government. Now, that might be good if you're a radical libertarian, but the fact is that a lot of people who would have to touch this system will be alienated from these common projects because they'll see how inefficient it is. They'll, especially a manpower-intensive, low-tech military, you'd have a lot of people doing make-work jobs, a lot of marching, a lot of things that aren't necessarily the things that would make them think highly of what it means to be part of this experience, and so that could alienate them. I mean, I used to work for a place that many of our board members had been drafted, and they always used to say that one of the reasons why they were so anti-government is because when they were conscripted, when they were drafted, they hated the experience and realized how silly government often was. So maybe as a libertarian, you might want to say, yeah, maybe we should do this. It would alienate people from big government.
So, General, I just want to give you a couple minutes just to respond to some of the points that were just raised there about whether unity is worth it or whether it would really be unifying at all.
Yeah, I think we drifted a little bit here in the conversation. If we guess that it would be disunifying, I guess would be the term, because it's a bad experience, that is presuming how it's executed. I'll go back to the core idea here. If you want to have a nation that survives, you have to have a nation with some sense of unity, some sense of shared obligation. I think the willingness to defend it is central to that. If it requires a draft, and it doesn't necessarily mean millions, it could. Depends if we're fighting the Chinese and the Russians at the same time, or if we're fighting something small. Whatever the requirement is, as I said in my opening comments, is defined by what the situation is. It's not defined by what we want. We're not going to put a square peg in a round hole, but the concept that people have that obligation to serve, to me, is central.
So I guess I want to take a moment and ask each of you what you think the strongest argument on the other side is, if you were to just entertain the argument. So first, Dr. Ruger, what do you find the most compelling argument, even if you don't ultimately find yourself persuaded by it, from the side that argues in favor of conscription?
Yeah, so I don't think that having the draft would make the United States less war-prone. But if there were an argument that would help convince me of this, it would be that. It's the Charlie Rangel argument, right? Yeah. Is that we'll avoid foolish, unnecessary wars like Vietnam or Iraq if we don't have, if we have the draft. Now, of course, we did do Vietnam and had the draft. And it took a long time for us to get out of Vietnam when the draft became so unpopular. So I'm not convinced of that argument. But if I could be compelled that it would make us get involved in fewer wars, that would be a very strong argument.
And General McChrystal, the same to you. What point speaks to you the most from the other side?
Yeah, the all-volunteer forces worked really well. I entered West Point when the draft was still on, and a close friend of mine, Sergeant Major Jeff Mellinger, was the last person drafted to still be in uniform. He got out in 2011. Tremendous command sergeant major when he got out. But the argument is, my personal experience, I served in a really good force, and people wanted to be there, and it was an extraordinarily professional entity. But my argument would be, my view was pretty parochial. If you are in a organization that is protected in a certain way, I wasn't thinking about the greater good of the nation. So on the all-volunteer force, I think it's a powerful argument, but I do think there's a broader consideration as well.
So you mentioned a couple scenarios, right? If we're fighting the Russians and the Chinese at the same time, but just as things stand today, if you had the power, nothing else changes on the world scene, to institute some form of mandatory military service, would you pull the lever? You would do it now?
That's a great question. I commanded the 75th Ranger Regiment. We had this really stupid haircut, high and tight. And we all said that if we ever got to be regimental commander, we'd do away with it. Well, I got to be regimental commander, and I didn't do away with it because I was comfortable. Mm-hmm. So what I say here, discount it. Yeah, I think what I would do is I would take our draft system now, I would expand it so that it included everyone, physically capable to do it, men, women, etc. So it's equal. And then I would have the selective service system, but I would oil the machine so that we would bring people in for training, not everybody, but I bring people so that we get both a mental and a sort of an emotional realization that this is something that if we fight a major war, we're going to have to do. And I probably would bring more people through for training and then send them back out to their jobs. Because I think if you look at places like Switzerland, where that's worked so well for years, I think that's where I'd go. I wouldn't bring millions of people in because you don't need them. You know, you don't have anything for them to do. But I would make sure everybody understands as soon as we need you, you've been trained, here you are, that sort of thing.
So Dr. Ruger, just that specific scenario, not the worst case scenario of drafting millions of people to go to war, what are your issues with what the general just outlined?
Yeah, I worry about it being arbitrary and subject to the corrupting influences of drafts that we've seen throughout history, right? So, you know, why doesn't Bill Clinton serve in the military, right? Because he gets a college deferment. A lot of Americans who had that opportunity.
Did he have heel spurs?
That was a different president.
Oh.
But the fact is that this just shows you that there are ways to game the system. And I would worry about the system being gamed so that only marginalized communities were the ones that had the brunt of this. And far from being unitive, that might seem actually something that would tear society apart, because it would look like we're the ones fighting the wars, but those people are able to sit home and enjoy themselves. As Dick Cheney said, you know, he had more important things to do, right? So I would worry about a country in which the people who had quote unquote more important things to do got to avoid it, whereas others had to go bear the brunt of this. And in a war with someone like China, for example, they're going to bear a very heavy brunt, because it's not going to be 7,000 Americans killed in that war, which is unfortunate enough from the global war on terror. It's going to be multiples of that.
Yeah.
And so I would worry about that. And I would bet you that McLean, Virginia's zip code is not going to have as many people killed in that war as South Boston.
That is the absolute challenge. And I would say we would be challenged to try to minimize that.
So I'm going to go to some of our audience questions here, one of which actually touches on the point that was just raised. So first to you, General McChrystal, if a draft were to be implemented, what would be the fairest way to do so? So you mentioned, for example, including women, but if you want to expand on anything else, how are you going to avoid on it being arbitrary or unequal in any kind of way?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm on thin ice, but what I would say, first off, everybody's got to be eligible. Then I think the draft has got to go after the skills and capabilities that we need, and everybody's not equal. So the reality is, in a modern force, we may be going to draft people who are more talented than people who are not. And we may be targeting people who have particular skills, whether it's cybersecurity or that sort of things. And that may feel and be unequal, but it's based on necessity. And so I think what we'd have to do is make it as equal as it could be, or as fair as it could be. But the reality is some people would be at a higher likelihood of being drafted because of what they would offer the force, what the requirement was.
Yeah, I guess, Dr. Ruger, the same question to you. Is it okay if it's unequal if it is, in a sense, fair?
No, I don't think so. And I also think that I'm not sure that America is ready for a universal draft that is truly universal. Especially, I think that I think we would have to have a much longer conversation about the issue of, for example, do we want to treat men and women the same when it comes to the drafting? And if we don't treat men and women the same, is it going to have the same type of unitary effect that we would want from it, right? So I think that those are some issues that would be quite fraught, I think. And again, when it comes to the issue of like health problems, you mentioned a couple of people that have had health, or one person that had a health issue. Will those health issues, I mean, like we see this all the time when it comes to disability insurance, it creates moral hazard. There'll be all types of opportunities for people to try to game that system.
Sure.
And I would worry about that. And again, like the people who game systems aren't the people who are, say, kind of less educated, let's say.
Yeah.
Right? Bill Clinton was going to know how to game that system in a way that I wouldn't have known when I was 18. And I would worry about that happening. And again, one of the things that I think that if you're really committed to universality is that it has to be universal. And then you start to bring in not just military service, but national involuntary service. And that has a whole plethora of other problems, especially economic. I mean, just imagine if we had to find work for 4 million Americans every year, and maybe you take 1 million into the military, but 3 million go into other sectors of the economy. It's going to be a lot of make work, and it's going to be a lot of displacement, right? So people who have jobs with dignity right now where they're being paid, why won't they be forced out? I mean, if I own a nursing home and I have to pay someone to do a kind of low marginal productivity job, why wouldn't I just try to volunteer to get the free one that the government provides, because they've essentially created an involuntary servitude situation with Johnny and Joey, right? I'll take that free person every day over a person that I actually have to pay. And, so I think that's a big problem.
So the next,
Could I jump on that
oh,
for just a second? Because in terms of drafting women, I got 3 granddaughters. You can get them tomorrow. No problem. But on the issue of national service, a lot of that's how it's done. If we look at people in AmeriCorps, City Year, those projects, which aren't as big as I think they ought to be, they vote at 3 times the rate of people who don't do a year or 2 of service. You have a different relationship with your society if you have that kind of experience. That's what the data tells us. So to the degree, it doesn't have to be masses of make work things. Many of these can be very effective programs that can be targeted. It's in the execution, in my view.
So this next question, I think, is a little off field, but I'll bring it back. Someone asks, how much do you believe the wokeness of the current administration, the Biden administration, has diminished the capabilities of our military and hurt recruitment efforts? And maybe to bring that back closer to the debate resolution, aren't there things, many things, short of conscription we could do to improve recruitment or improve the lethality of our fighting force or the effectiveness of our fighting force, whether it's offering higher salaries, or you mentioned the shockingly high percentage of people that are excluded? Isn't it better to look at relax some of those restrictions or rules before going to force? So the general, first to you.
Yeah, that's a pretty wide one. I'm not sure I know what woke really means. I think that Fort Benning, Georgia, where I was as a young boy, and my father and grandfather served there, had 2 movie theaters on the same street. And I used to think, what a great thing. 2 movie theaters. One was for African American soldiers and one was for white soldiers. And that was in the 1930s. You go to the Pentagon today, there's a ton of restrooms at the Pentagon. It's so convenient. And I wondered why. And then I read the book. It was built in 1940, and it was because it was built in Virginia, and you had to have white and black restrooms. So the point is, when I think of woke, I think of more basic than things. Now, I'm an old soldier, so I think everybody should be in formation at 6 o'clock in the morning and shut up and don't give me a hard time. So I'm not real liberal in that way, and I don't think that the military should be. I think the military needs to be as hard as it needs to be. We can't make combat easier. So we have to have forces that are able to operate on a really lethal battlefield. So you can't make things comfortable for people in the military if it means that they're going to be unfit for the battlefield. And so this is where we often have a tension. And I think this is where, we get it right, we get a little bit wrong. When I was a commander, if one of your soldiers got a heat injury, you were in big trouble. But if you were going to push your soldiers in the summer hard enough doing road marches and whatnot, you're going to get a certain percentage of people who get a heat injury. There's just no way to do both. And so the reality is, I think we've got to understand what the requirement is, what kind of force we have to do, and we can be as liberal and caring as possible as long as we don't undermine the effectiveness of the force.
So, Dr. Ruger, the same question to you. Is our military too woke, or more broadly, are there other things we could do to improve it that come far before a conscription effort?
Yeah. I mean, I think the military has done a pretty fantastic job, actually, at making sure that it is open to all the parts of our society that would like to participate in the virtue of military service. I think that in that sense, it's been doing a great job. I think I would mention 2 things. One is margins matter. So even small margins can matter. So it could generally be doing a good job, but on the margins, has it shifted enough that it affects recruitment? And then 2 is, even if there is no margin, even if the military is not woke at all, is there a perception of that? And is that affecting it? And so what I would say is that whether it's perceived or real on the margins, I think that it should be combated. And I also think that there's a lot of people that are chagrined by the double standards, right? So there are some things that the military actively celebrates, and there are other things that you couldn't get away with, right? So if you wore a lanyard that was pro-life, I think they would tell you you're out of uniform. There are other causes that if you wear a lanyard for it, they don't tell you anything. And that becomes politicized. But again, that's on the margins. That's not the main thing. I mean, one of the great things about the military and why I don't like any lanyards is because we all wear the same uniform depending on our service. The only color you are when you're in the Navy and you're in combat is the guacamole green, right? And I think that's a wonderful thing about it, about the military, is that it is that focus on that, and it should be meritocratic. So any hint of this, I think, should be extirpated from the military, especially because in combat you have to, and you know, the general knows more about this than I certainly do. You know, you have to trust that the people around you care about you because you're their battle buddy, because you're an American, not because of other things that might divide us as a country. Yeah. But I do think there are other things that we could do to improve recruiting. I mean, one thing is that you read the Navy Times or the Army Times, you hear about bad living conditions, or you hear about rules that aren't necessarily required for lethality. I'll just give you one example from my experience that just is so frustrating, and again, it's on the margins. It affects whether you're going to be retained or recruited. Is the darn computer takes forever to boot up, and you're like, I just want to work for my country, and I got to spend 20 minutes doing this, and then talk to IT, and that happens so often. You laugh, but it happens so often that it's frustrating. So on the margins, does it cause you to say, like, I did my 8 years, I'm out of here? And I don't think that's the military we want. So let's try to fix those things.
Sure.
I came out of Afghanistan in the summer of 2002 and was assigned my first tour in the Pentagon. And so the vice director for operations on the Joint Staff, and I'm at this desk, and they've got like 3 computers and all these 1,000 cords and stuff like that under. And I'm working about 7:30 one night. I've just had it up to here, and literally one of the power supplies bursts into flame, and it's about 2 inches of flame. And I'm just looking at this thing, and part of me wanted to just walk out, turn the lights off, and go home. I didn't, but it's that sort of thing. The military can drive you crazy. We used to say in the Army, the only thing worse than being a soldier was not being a soldier. Yeah.
So I would add something to that related to the debate, because I think it is relevant, which is that when you have a volunteer force, there's a feedback mechanism called recruitment and retention problems.
Yeah.
And so when you're irritated by this or that, in the civilian world, because I work in the civilian world, like I have to deal with recruitment and retention. And we have to sell that, we're a better employer than the next guy. If you have the draft, you don't have to sell anything. You could use and abuse those people for a year, and people will do the right thing. Like the general, I'm sure, is a great leader. I love his book, Team of Teams. He's going to lead his people well and have high retention. But we also know that there's General Schmuckatelli, who isn't leading his people that way, and those people are going to leave. But or they can't leave under the draft until their time is up. And I would just worry about more people being abused and squandered if we had a draft form of service.
Yeah, General, you want to respond?
No, it's a hugely. I just want to agree with Will. That's an absolutely valid point. You get lazy. It's easy to get lazy. I also think if we expanded the idea of woke, and I don't think most people include it, but a lot of mothers won't let their daughters enter the military because they're not sure they're going to be safe from sexual harassment. And to be honest, I can tell you, in all my career, I never personally saw it. I never had but I was in mostly male units, so I wouldn't have had that. But the reality is that's a market-driven thing. If we can't convince people that it's safe, therefore it needs to be safe. If we can't convince people it's safe, we lose a whole lot of people, talent coming in the service. And so that's one of those things you don't want people to get lazy on. But that can be dealt with by leadership.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think this also relates to our foreign policy as a whole. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of debating American foreign policy. That's not why we're here. But I do think it relates, which is in a draft form of manpower policy, there's a lot of ability of our civilian and military leaders to use that force as it sees fit without thinking too hard about recruitment and retention. But under a voluntary force, they have to. And I'll give you an example. Like, I think our foreign policy over the last 30 years has not been wise, to say the least. I think American soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines have fought it well, but I don't think that there's been a great amount of concern that should have been shown by our leaders for this. And if you read the book, the Afghanistan papers, you see some of that, where it's very clear that a lot of our leaders don't really know how to get to strategic victory, but they continue to pour people into it. I think that that would be even worse under a draft regime. And it's one of the reasons why my wife and I argue about this. We have a son, he's a great athlete. He'd make an amazing Navy SEAL. I'd be so proud of him. Even if he joined the Army and became a Green Beret, I'd kind of be proud of him too. But I think Mom in particular worries, like, is the U.S. government going to use his sacrifice, potentially even the ultimate sacrifice? Are they going to use it honorably? And that's why I think one way to fix our problem too is to make sure that our grand strategy is correct, that our foreign policy is correct, so that people know when they're sending their children abroad to fight in our wars, that it's done to secure America's vital national interests. And I think that's been a problem. I think there have been Americans, particularly during the Iraq War, who said, like, I don't want my kids to go to Iraq because it seems like there's no good strategy and we're not doing well, and I don't want my kid to die in that war.
But how far?
Let me.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Because I disagree.
Okay.
Now, I don't disagree. I don't believe our foreign policy's been all that slick. You're right there.
Yeah.
But I think that the conclusion about a draft versus a volunteer army, and I go back to the history of France after World War II. France had a draft army, but they also had a professional part of the force. When they went back to Indochina, they used no draftees. They used just professional soldiers and some from the colonies. They fought for 9 years and then lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Because it was a very unpopular war, but there weren't draftees dying, so it decreased the national resistance to it. When they went to Algeria a couple of years later, they did use draftees, and the exact opposite occurred.
Yeah.
The national force to stop that war became executive.
Yeah.
I just think the conclusion, I draw a different conclusion.
So, Dr. Ruger, just to put a point on that, couldn't the history you outlined also undercut the efficacy of the volunteer military as a way to, and the recruitment feedback mechanism? But we've had it in place, and we did spend all those years in Afghanistan, and we did go into Iraq. And
yeah, but I think there was some feedback loops, right? So, you saw the development of the MRAP because of the fact that there was a real concern about not just that we were, not doing well, but that it could cause a recruitment problem if it seemed like this was happening, or just shoddy electrical work, things like that. I do think that when you have volunteers, I mean, for all of you that run businesses, like, just answer this question: like, if the people you got to work for you were yours no matter what for a year, would you treat them differently than if you had to make sure that you kept their service? And I think the fact is that, even though we have great intentions, I think if they have to show up every morning no matter what, you're just not going to have to offer them as many benefits. Maybe you don't care, maybe you provide good housing but not great. Maybe you provide good salary but not great. I think that's what happens. And again, it's not to say that you can't do, that things are kind of like 0 or 1, right? Like, you're going to be able to fight wars and you're going to be able to win some wars with the draft military and with a professional military, right? But on the margins, again, which is a better system? And I go back to the economic arguments, the moral arguments, and the military arguments for why a volunteer force is better.
But so when the military has increasingly become, like the general mentioned, something that a tiny slice of America does, right? And fathers and their sons, or mothers and their daughters are doing, doesn't the broader public check out from a lot of these things? I mean, I bet you a shocking percentage of my peers in my age group couldn't point to Iraq on a map, or Afghanistan on a map. And if you ultimately, these things are decided through the democratic process. Who we elect as president becomes commander in chief. Who we elect as Congress is supposed to at least vote on authorizing wars. If the people don't have skin in the game through national service, doesn't that take away a force, like the general argued, for keeping the military ambitions in check and on track?
Again, I go back to Vietnam, where we had a draft and it took a long, long time for us to get out. Again, like, unfortunately, in our system of government, or any system of government, it's easy for the government to send people abroad to fight and die. It's the nature of politics. And we're going to fight necessary and unnecessary wars, no matter which system of manpower policy we have. But I do think that the arguments just seem so compelling to me, not just to me, but to the Pentagon, right? Like, the Pentagon doesn't generally want to go backwards, that's probably unfair.
I challenge that.
Yeah, unfair. The Pentagon doesn't seem to want to go back to the direction of a draft. At least their revealed preferences.
Yeah.
Right. Now, there are people, and again, like, just because the general is in the minority doesn't mean that he's wrong. But I think that the military generally likes to have people that want to be there. They want to make sure that they can be professionalized, that there's an investment in their technological skills, and also that we have the resources to have more sophisticated platforms. So I think that those things speak to why we continue to have.
So an interesting question just came in from the audience. If we could posit that 10 years from now, the United States will face an existential threat, would you then support a draft, Dr. Ruger?
I mean, I would just challenge the question. I don't think that the United States is going to face an existential threat over the next 10 years. I mean, I don't even think that China is an existential threat unless we get into a war in which there's a nuclear exchange. And so the way to avoid a war with nuclear exchanges is to avoid what are called escalatory spirals, and to avoid what's called the Lippmann gap, the gap between your desired ends and your capabilities. So sure, if like we wanted to defend, if we went back in time 5 years and wanted to defend Hong Kong from, further Chinese, control, I don't know how to do that, but we could do it, and we'll probably end up in a nuclear war, right? So that would be existential. The way to avoid a nuclear exchange over Hong Kong is you don't fight over Hong Kong, which is what we did, right? And this is a reductio ad absurdum, because it's absurd to think we would have fought a war over Hong Kong. But that also means that in order to avoid those circumstances, you have to avoid that Lippmann gap, that gap between our capabilities and our ends. And so I think American foreign policy, in order to avoid that existential challenge, needs to be wise about what our ends and means are and what could be accomplished using the military. And that's not really a manpower issue, because these are challenges no matter what type of manpower. But again, I don't want to get into a situation where we're making arguments about what our policy should be in peacetime today, which is what the prompt is, versus a lifeboat situation, right?
Right. So I guess a question that did come in from the audience.
Can I answer that question, though?
Oh, well, this is a similar one, but it just asks what would trigger the necessity, or as Dr. Ruger suggested, do you think there are likely existential threats in the next 10 years, General?
Yeah, I think there are. And I think the probability is not zero that we will face that. It wouldn't take me much to see a still surviving Vladimir Putin or his replacement with a Russia that is strategically weak in the long term, but pretty strong in the short term, be able to continue to push Europe into greater and greater conflict, in which case suddenly the economic part of the world that we are connected with gets weakened. And then at the same time, if we throw in China, if Xi Jinping, who does what he says he's going to do, which is get control over Taiwan again, if he follows through, then I think it's very easy for us to be at an existential threat. It's unfair to draw historical conclusions, but if we go back to Munich before World War II, and Chamberlain makes the agreement with Adolf Hitler, that we all later go, wow, that was not a good move. In the moment, a lot of people thought that it was a very good move. And the reality is, I think you can walk yourself into existential threats. you can put yourself in a position where suddenly threats grow and they combine. And so that's what worries me. And if you then ask the punchline to the question, would I wish that we had a draft now so that we start to build that up? The answer is yes, going back with all the qualifiers done, implemented perfectly, which it wouldn't be, but you know, all of those things.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I want to just add,
Real quick,
like,
then we have to go to the
E-
closing.
even assuming that the United States should defend Taiwan, then you need a lot of high-tech sensors, torpedoes, small boats, and so forth.
Right.
You don't need 3 million men and women of various types of capabilities. You need high tech.
All right, we will now move to the closing statement portion of the debate. Remember to vote in the post-debate poll so we can see the shift in the audience and their perception of this issue. And up first, General McChrystal will make his closing statement from the podium.
Yeah, not much to say. I think we all know that if we have a nation that's based on an agreement, a covenant, which we do, then we have responsibilities to follow that through. I think a military draft is something that we all have to accept as a requirement, and then that requirement needs to be shaped for the needs of the moment. I think it's as simple as that. If we were to step away and find other arguments that say we shouldn't have one because it's not raining today, so we don't need an umbrella, I think that's a mistake. Simple as that. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Ruger.
Sure. I'll try to match that strunk and white, concise statement. Again, what I laid out in my opening and in my conversation is really like centered around those three key things, right? So one, I just think we have a different understanding about the political philosophic foundations of our society. I think that Americans love their freedom. I think America is about freedom. And I think what that means is that Americans should be able to freely choose their occupation, their profession. I think that means that we should not have peacetime draft. And so it's a moral issue, but it's also an economic one, right? In terms of the high cost to people of having to involuntarily serve as opposed to pursuing other parts of their lives, building their skills in that way, right? It's not as if you go in for a year in a draft situation and you're learning the kind of high-tech skills that you might as a professional. You're getting basics. You're doing ruck marches. You're learning how to salute. You're even trying to figure out how to use DTS, right? Those are the things you're doing. Those skills aren't really all that transferable to the civilian world. And so when you compare that to sending people to college, going into the workforce, or for a lot of people just starting their families, I think there's a huge economic loss there and a mismatch in terms of resource allocation. And then finally, like I said, is we need a professionalized military that has lethality at its core, and that is best achieved through spending the scarce resources we do, which aren't that scarce. We're talking about $1 trillion. But we need that $1 trillion that we're spending to go towards the type of military we've developed to be able to, if it does come to it, to be able to fight China in a way that is relevant to that world. Because again, this isn't the plains of northern Europe in the 1860s where you need lots of mass and material, right? No, this is going to be us fighting at sea. It's going to be in the air. That's a very different type of thing. And those technologies are expensive, and we need to maintain on the cutting edge of that. So I would say let's not waste the money trying to put 3-4 million people through boot camp. Let's have a professionalized military that's lethal and that doesn't have the economic and moral costs associated with the draft. Thank you.
Well, let's give both of our debaters a round of applause. And are we able to put the post-debate poll results up on the screen, or will those?
This is the worst part of the evening, right?
I've never seen this before.
So it's kind of hard to see from here, but it appears the amount of people that agree with the resolution increased, and the amount that disagree decreased, and many people got off of the fence.
All right, you won, General. Good job.
Wow. Very interesting.
Thanks.
If you haven't voted in the poll yet, please do. We will post the final poll, both the pre and post-debate poll, on our website, steamboatinstitute.org. Once again, thank you to New College, to the Socratic Stage, for their support also in making tonight's debate possible. I would like to also extend once again a special thanks to the Adolph Coors Foundation and the other foundations and individuals who support us for making this debate possible tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's debate and would like to see more debates on college campuses across the country, including back here at New College, we ask you go to steamboatinstitute.org and support us with your financial contribution. We are a 501c3. Please go to Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel. We have this debate and all of our great debates are available for you to watch for free. For those of you who are here with us in person, we're going to have pizza and conversation with the speakers out in the courtyard, so you can join us. Thank you also to our online audience for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed tonight's debate here at New College of Florida in Sarasota. Thanks again for coming.